question, why are we having this webinar in the first place? And why is it so important to build an early stage management team? And we've had some thoughts on the matter, and we've published recently an editorial on our website where we discussed here what keeps great startups from raising financing. And it comes down, in our view, to the disconnect between the wonderful science that our founders can create and have created, and their abilities to create teams, to raise funds, to write grants, and how to translate that in the form of a startup that can raise financing. And the missing link here is that founding teams, scientific teams, often lack the competencies needed for commercial success. So those teams are absolutely required for success, but insufficient. And our goal at the BII is to help bridge that gap and help founding teams understand exactly what type of competencies are required, what type of people want to work with those companies, and make that match and allow those people to join our startup companies. Since we started 3 years ago, we've funded 17 companies, for example, in our Creation House program, where already now, most are still active, but already now 3 companies have raised 26 million euros in financing from 5 international VCs. The common trait in those companies was either that they had a team in place or that they had an understanding that more people and more companies were required for success and were able to discuss with their new investors around that team. A second theme that we know is companies fail to tell their messaging, and that also is, of course, related to the people that are involved. It's not only what you say, but it's also who says it and how they say it. And so having a good team is, of course, important there. So with this in mind, one of the things we've done recently is we announced a partnership this week with Coulter Partners. So Coulter Partners is a global life science executive search firm based in London. And the reason we chose Coulter's is not only do they do search, but they also do leadership assessment. And Coulter's is helping the BII portfolio and all of our CEOs with assessment and understanding their strengths and weaknesses such that they can go get a team that complements their skills and help them on their journey. So, we're happy to be working with Coulter, and I welcome them on this call. And in the theme of partnerships, I'd also like to announce today that we are entering into a partnership with our guests today, Abingworth Life Science Investments. The reason we've chosen to partner with is their great experience in starting companies and funding companies and exiting those companies. The specific roles they'll be playing at the BII will be to join our therapeutic advisory group, helping us look at our deal flow and advising the BII on what companies we should take in and that would have high potential in the BII and post-BII. So I'm really happy to announce that today and welcome Abingworth as a venture capital partner to the BII. With that in mind, I'd like to introduce our 2 guests that will talk more about building early stage teams. The first is Tim Haynes, who's chairman and managing partner of Abingworth since 2005. He has a long track record of success and has been involved in many successful companies. The same as Sarah Shackleton, who is partner and head of marketing and talent at Abingworth, and it's the main reason we asked them to hold this webinar, and that they view talent as so important that they have dedicated staff to make sure they have the best people in their portfolio. Sarah's been in Abingworth since 2004 and also very involved in many of their successful companies. So with that in mind, before I hand over to them, I'd like to ask everyone to mute their microphones. If you do have any questions, please post them in the chat field. And at the end of the presentation, I'll be happy to take them and share them with Sarah and Tim. So with that in mind, I'll stop my presentation here and ask everyone to take over. And I think that's you, Tim, right?
That's great. Yeah, thank you, Bobby, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here, and first of all, delighted to be involved in the BII initiative. I think it's a fantastic initiative for Europe and for early opportunities. I think more generally, moving on to today's topic, team building, it's kind of a truism that team building is important for all companies, and I guess I've been privileged to spend most of my career on the operating side, running companies in the US, Europe, and the UK before 15 years ago crossing over to the dark side of venture capital. So I've kind of seen it from both aspects. But I guess my introductory comments would be that I think life sciences venture in particular, team building is really fundamental. Bobby's touched on a couple of the points, but I think there are really three things that differentiate life sciences early stage from many other sectors. I think the first one is the complexities and the timelines of what we do, I think, are very different from many other industries. I think we are actually still a very young industry, the biotech side. It means there's not really a pool of experienced talent, particularly in Europe. I think that's very much a challenge for sure. And then I think the third piece is that you don't really get a chance to learn if you're joining the management team of a life science company. It's all about execution from day one. So I think the whole selection process up front, getting the right team is absolutely fundamental. So what we're going to do, we're going to split it into two. If you could just next slide, please, Sarah. I'm just going to give you a very brief introduction to Abingworth, and then hand it over to Sarah, and she and I will do a bit of a double act, just really hitting on some of the highlights. Why talent matters, I think we've touched on that to some degree already. And then I think really thinking about building best teams. And many of you will know these things, but I think between Sarah, myself, and the Abingworth, hopefully we can give you some insights that are really worth thinking about. And obviously there's a whole group of specific roles that are absolutely key. And I think, focus is oftentimes on the CEO, but I think managing the full plethora of individuals who are involved from the outset, they'll change as the company develops and goes forward. But chairs, broader management team is absolutely fundamental. And then we'll just touch on a few recruiting tips. I think let's go through three case studies for you, two European and one in the US. So next slide, please, Sarah. So just a few words about Abingworth. I think many of you will know us. I'll just take a minute or so just to remind you. We've been around since 1973, very strong, scientifically driven organization. Pretty much therapeutic focus these days. We have historically done some medical devices, but we've really moved predominantly into the biotech space, really reflection of how strong the space is performing. And I think more fundamentally, the fact that the pharmaceutical industry has become pretty reliant on what venture is doing, which has improved our lives significantly from 15 plus years ago when I was a CEO of a biotech company. 168 investments, you can see the data there, so a significant amount of experience. And I think we've always held huge store in quality of recruitment of the management team. Just a little bit on the strategy. We do about half in early stage investing, company creation. So we'll probably do about 22, 23 deals per fund, of which half, so say 12 plus deals will be in early stage, and about half will be company creation. And obviously in this area in particular, finding good management teams, most of the science will come out of academia, and we'll touch on that. Putting in place management teams, boards, advisors, etc., is really critical. We then do, unlike many other venture groups, we do what we call development stage. This is later stage. We'll invest in late stage private companies. We'll also invest in public companies. And actually, there's a very different dynamic there. It's more challenging to influence and change management, but nonetheless still very important. And then a strategy that we develop called clinical co-development, where we take late stage products, we fund them, we run them through portfolio companies, and we then have a put back to the owner of the asset, be a pharma company or a biotech company. So very broad in a strategy sense, pretty broad in a therapeutic sense. I'm sure, as many of you know, pretty much 50% of what's being developed, both in biotech and pharma, is in oncology, and that's reflected in what we do. But obviously broadening it out in terms of disease area, genetically driven disease is hugely critical. And we're increasingly into CNS as the biology is being unwound a little bit. Thanks, Sarah. Just a little bit of an insight. We've been very successful in terms of FDA approvals. We've got 19 drugs approved in the last 7 years. We're quietly proud of that. Obviously, there's a financial returns, but I think we're all hugely privileged to be in an industry where we're actually making an impact to patients' lives. And then I think the last slide for me, just to underscore not only breadth in terms of stage of where we invest and look at opportunities, but also breadth as well. And I think this is really interesting in terms of, and I know Sarah will touch on it, the difference in the US to Europe, and obviously up to approximately 70% of the biotech industry is in those 3 key hubs, but they all have very different personalities and characteristics and different challenges in terms of building teams. But I'll stop there and hand over to the real expert, my colleague Sarah Shackleton.
Great. Thank you very much, Tim. Can you hear me? Can you guys hear me?
Yes,
we can. Yeah.
Okay. Yep. Thank you.
Yes, we can.
That's good.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, super. So talent matters. We've touched on this already. It's kind of an obvious point, some may say, but because some of you in the audience today may not have worked in biotech, I just wanted to clarify how it matters in a biotech context. So we're interested in science and leadership, as we've mentioned. And if you build the best teams, both on the science side, on the commercial side, depending on where your company is, you'll find that those best teams are very, very good at developing the vision and the business plan. And then they can raise the money and execute against that plan, which ultimately means that they're building value in the company, which brings us to the result of the high returns. And thinking back to that FDA approval slide that Tim just showed, new medicines that get onto the market. So that is what can happen if you back great teams. And we've done that several times. In fact, we like to repeat it. If we found a CEO and a team who have been successful, we will often try to work with them again in a different company. And we've got some case studies that will touch on that later on. As also has been mentioned, we believe in this so much that we actually have a partner also. We have me here all day long, basically focusing on the people aspects of investing. And what that means for Abingworth is the pre-deal, before we do the deal, we will diligence at least 2, if not more, members of the team. We'll look at the CEO, and increasingly over the years, we've put our focus on the chair, because we'll come back to this theme throughout this presentation, but we think that the chair maximizes the success of the CEO and the team and the company. There may be a C-suite person, a chief medical officer, a chief scientific officer that we want to dig into and see how strong they are. Post-deal, we'll take that information and we will strengthen the senior management team as necessary and the board, working with the portfolio company. And then we're constantly trying to expand our network. So I'm sure some of you on the call today we've met or would hope to meet in the future. We want to know the key entrepreneurs. We want to make sure that we know the key pharma decision makers, people that could serve as chairs on our companies, and non-executive board directors and CEOs. So then I think this raises questions, what are we looking for? In a very, very perfect world, we would like great novel science and a strong team. I mean, that's the ideal. Doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes you get great science, but you get a weak team. And then we're left with 2 options. We either pass on the deal if we're in the pre-deal diligence, or we take the information, we think, okay, it's a great company, there's some team members here who are good. We will do the deal and we'll rebuild the team after the deal. And that may mean complementing the CEO. It may even mean moving on the CEO or other particular C-suite members. And again, we'll come back to that in a minute. How we evaluate them at the time is really much depends on what kind of company we're looking for, what kind of skills they need. We'll look at where the team comes from, what successes they've had. And we'll also look at how they handle challenges and setbacks. And again, that's a theme that we will come back to. And we will try to ascertain all of this by assessing them via meetings that we have with them, and also referencing lots and lots of heavy, in the trade, we call it forensic referencing. And I've tried to put together here a little a kind of map of how we would look, what we would look for in the ideal CEO in terms of skills and characteristics. A few points here. I think if I pick up on the communication skills, what we mean here really is we want a CEO and a top team who are able to sell both themselves but the company. They can get on the podium, they can ignite enthusiasm from an audience because of their vision of the company and how they can describe and articulate that to external audiences. And it's not just to investors, to get investors interested for fundraising purposes, obviously, but it also might mean that if you've got a great CEO with these kind of skills, they can attract a better C-suite because they can sell their company to the candidates. So it's a pretty critical skill. Another skill that we look for is leadership. Again, kind of an obvious point, but if you're thinking about how leadership looks in a biotech context, we would probably refer to it as entrepreneurial leadership. And we're looking for people that have got that vision. They can see opportunities and they can clearly manage people, both on the R&D side. They need to be able to manage scientists as well as more commercial people. But also very, very critical is that they can manage change, because there are going to be ups and downs. There are going to be setbacks in biotech. Clinical trials may not work out. The technology may have blips. There's going to be setbacks, and we need leaders who can adjust and be flexible and adapt to changing environment and changing circumstances. So that is a really, really important point. And I was just going to give one quick example here of one of the early CEOs when I joined Abingworth was a guy who ran a company called DevGen. He was called Thierry Bogert. Some of you may know him. And he started his company. It was a platform for discovering sorry, I'm reading a question. It was a platform for discovering drug targets for human health, but it found its eventual home as a platform for improving crop genetics. And he did a fantastic exit, sold the company to Syngenta, and he, interestingly, was a founding CEO, founding academic CEO, and he went the whole distance with the company, and we'll come back to that. So that's another important point. I think also energy, urgency, and resilience definitely need a sense of urgency in biotech. It needs to be done yesterday. And that resilience, again, for these ups and downs, people that have the fortitude to keep going, I think is important. So moving on, CEOs, I think many of you will know this, but they're to build, they've got a number of key tasks. They need to build that top team, attract that top team. They need to help build their board. They need to advance the technology to the next stage, execute on that business plan that they've developed, and raise finance. Very, very critical skill for a biotech CEO. And of course, in a ideal world, achieve a successful exit. Which is great for the whole team and great for the therapeutics that they've developed in terms of getting onto the market. There are a number of CEO leadership models, particularly for early stage companies. Some companies proceed without a CEO initially, and we'll come to give you an example of that with Gamma Delta later on. Some of them, we've got an early stage company in the US at the moment, and there's a venture capitalist who is the interim CEO. And that venture capitalist is leading the search for the replacement full-time CEO, but he's building the initial team and getting the premises set up and doing all the early work. Sometimes we were looking at a deal very recently where we found a part-time consultant CEO who managed the company and has continued to build it and probably become the Series A CEO. Sometimes you have the executive chair. You hire an executive chair. We've got this in the US at the moment with Bill Lissett Jasper. He's executive chair, but he's acting as the CEO. And then other times you're bringing on a full-time CEO who's able to transition to that Series A, or someone who replaces the initial CEO at the Series A. So there's lots of different ways of bringing in the CEO. What is relatively rare, as I've already given one example of how it can be the case, but it's relatively rare, is that the academic founder becomes the CEO. The academic founders obviously provide incredibly important scientific leadership and very, very accomplished people, but they don't necessarily have that industry experience to be the CEO. Sometimes we see this a little bit more in the US. Sometimes they might become the part-time chief scientific officer. And the first time one of our case study CEOs, Gary Glick, moved from academia into a company he co-founded, he became the CSO first. But what they really need to do in most of the cases is hand over the day-to-day R&D work to a VP of R&D or a chief scientific officer, and that's often a very key hire. Let's see. However, we still like to retain and capture all that expertise. So we find that we find the academic founders very, very useful and instrumental as often members of or chairs of the scientific advisory boards. And we've got on the screen here, we've got Judith Shizuru, who's the co-founder of Jasper, one of our companies in the US, and she chairs the SAB of Jasper. And her co-founder, Susan Prohaska. Susan actually took a role as an executive so she's VP of Program Management and Operations at Jasper. So sometimes a co-founder or a founder can become an executive within the team. We'll have another example of that later on. So for example, at Gamma Delta, one of the co-founders, Oliver, is an executive in the company. I've mentioned some examples here. Execure, one of the founding scientists is actually the CEO of Execure, David Giljahan. That's an oligonucleotide delivery platform company, and he's gone all the way through with the company. And IFM will come back to at the end with Gary Glick, who's become the CEO of multiple IFM companies. So here we want to look at what can you do to maximize CEO success, because in the Abingworth portfolio, the last time I checked, half of our companies had first-time CEOs. And so they've either come up a scientific route or they've come up a business development route. And what we have found to really, really help is to get them a good chairman or woman. We think it's absolutely critical. The chair will mentor the CEO, give the strategic input, also help manage the board, because managing the board is one of the derailers that we find when we've looked at the success of our most successful companies and our most successful CEOs and those that have struggled more. So having a chair to help at the beginning is really, really, really helpful. They can also help with fundraising. Sometimes we bring in an executive chair for first-time CEOs, and that is simply a chair who is much more hands-on. So they might work at the company 2, even maybe 3 days a week, and work with the CEO quite closely. We often encourage our first-time CEOs to take a biotech board seat. In other words, sit on the board of another biotech company and see the board and the CEO role from that different switched perspective. That can be helpful. And then the other point is to ensure that the first-time CEO or any CEO engages with the full board, because there's a lot of value there. You know, the VCs bring a lot of experience, they bring skills and networks. The non-executive directors have independent views. They often have a very different network and set of expertise. And then occasionally you might put on, if you can attract it, a very heavy hitter individual, and they can be good across the board, but they can be particularly good from my perspective as being magnets for talent and help bring great people to the team. In terms of
sorry, I just wanted to add one quick point just on the maximizing the CEO. I think one of the things that I would urge people involved in building companies is to put in place remuneration committees or compensation committees very early on. I am a strong believer in management by objectives, both for the CEO and through the corporation. And I do think having dedicated committees that are tracking performances and really together with the chairman of the company counseling them, obviously it's linked to compensation, but I think as a format, very, very important. I think so the venture capital community is not great necessarily, even if you've hired somebody who's very good at the time you hire them, the business can change. And I think really that's a very important tool to ensure constant assessment of performance, potentially trigger change or readapt the profile in the firm. So just a slight addition to your very thoughtful slide.
That's a great point. Thanks, Tim. So we've been looking at the CEOs, and I think on this slide, we just wanted to look at the rest of the team. How do you build the rest of the team? And there is no cookie cutter template here because it will very much depend on what skill sets you have in your CEO, possibly your chair, and what kind of company you have, and how the company is evolving. You may rely initially on consultants or entrepreneurs in residence from your VC board to help you. I think one important point here is to try to ensure that you have some industry expertise in the firm, particularly if you're a therapeutics company having some drug development. Someone who's discovered and developed drugs early on is very, very helpful. Again, that point I just made, but engage with the VCs because we do this repeatedly. I mean, we build companies and we build teams. And if you engage early, you can avoid having to deconstruct your team. So if you try and build your team too soon, you can even talk to the VCs before or during the fundraising to get thoughts on that. And then I was going to turn now just to practical tips on hiring. So you're trying to build your team. Some of these are going to seem very obvious, but not everyone gets them right. I can guarantee you that. So early on, it's really quite helpful if you define your needs clearly. You can be flexible and change that depending on who you meet, but just at least know what your ideal profile would look like that's realistic. And if there are any headhunters listening to this, they will understand what I mean by that, because sometimes clients have, completely unrealistic goals. But I think it's important to aim high. You should always start there. And obviously you want to hire the best people. So if you aim high, you're more likely to do that. My recommendation is that you use, when you start looking for new team members, use your networks and use executive search firms. Some companies like to just use their own networks. Even with me here, even if I'm doing a search, I will prefer in a perfect world to also partner with a search firm, because I'm ultimately going to be responsible for putting the best person in as CEO or chief medical officer. And I want to make sure that no stone was unturned, that we found all the best people. I think also if you just use your networks, things can get potentially a little bit clubby. So you just need to watch that, I think, particularly on boards. When you're deciding on your recruiter, ask for their track records and their potential profiles. Most headhunters can headhunt, so it's not that they lack the skills to do it. It's just that you're going to be at an advantage if you're looking for a chief medical officer and you go with a recruiter who's done 10 recently, is not in the middle of 10 at the moment, because that won't work well. But if they've done 10 recently, they will have a benchmark in their mind of who is the right type of CMO for your organization, and they'll know who's good and who's not good, who's available, who's not available. It's just a useful approach. And then you can ask them to bring potential candidates to the pitch. And if they talk through those candidates, they can be anonymized. You're not asking for free people ideas here. You're mostly trying to clarify in your heads, with the help of these profiles, what you think you really need. And then once you start meeting candidates, I think it's really important that you collect as many data points as possible to help you with the evaluation. Most interviews are not structured, so try to structure yours. Most people spend under an hour with the people in the first interview, and you can't really get to know people in just an hour. We've sometimes worked with psychometrics, particularly increasingly with some of the search firms that are using psychometrics but I wouldn't say that we're expert in that. I think it's very useful if you're the CEO hiring a chief medical officer, ask them to present to the senior see how they operate under pressure, how they, we encourage our CEOs to do this, and it tends to work out quite well. And then reference. You need to find people that are both on their referee list and off their referee list, and you need to find people that have worked with them and know them. This is particularly tricky when you're hiring somebody from Big Pharma, because if you're hiring someone from Big Pharma, they themselves probably have not worked in and so don't have quite the same calibration of what that involves and what this person, what kind of environment this person will need to work in. So I think that's always a bit of a tricky one. And take the time to evaluate thoroughly. You know, when we've made mistakes in the past, it's normally because we've been a little bit desperate. Maybe the search hasn't gone well, and then we've been under pressure and under time pressure. I think if you just need to take that time, as difficult as it may be, given your timelines. So if we pause now, I think what we want to do here is give a few case studies. And this one, I'm going to probably turn over to Tim in a minute, but this one
Sure.
I picked because I think this one is an example of how, you know, a real team helped propel Gamma Delta forward. There were lots of different people that came in at different points to build this team. And Bobby asked me to give this kind of example, so I chose Gamma Delta. And I'm going to let Tim kick off because he sits on the board and was just intimately involved in putting this all together. So Tim, do you want to talk through this?
Yeah, I'll just try and focus on the highlights as it relates to people. But this was a company we invested in about 4.5 years ago now. De Novo Science. We saw what was happening in T cells, in particular their role either directly or through CARs in impacting around cancers. Two challenges we saw: working well in hematological cancers, less well in solid tumors. And then obviously most of the initial cell therapy was autologous. So we were looking for cells that would impact solid tumors and ideally become allogeneic opportunities. So we tracked this science down through one of our scientific founders. We'd known Adrian for a number of years, and we said, yeah, we like this. Gamma Delta T cells, really interesting. So we said, we put some seed money in, we started to build the team. And I guess the two interesting things, and I've lived this personally as CEO of a company called Aztecs a number of years ago, the relationship with the founding scientist is a real, it's an opportunity, but it's also a challenge. These are his firstborn children, and he's been working in this area for 20 years. His first response is, well, I could be a CEO. I'm a brilliant academic. And as Sarah said, there are some who have all those attributes, but actually, while they may be running, head of an academic department and think that they rule the roost, actually operating in a biotech environment is very, very different. So I think making that assessment early on and deflating to some degree the founder's aspirations. And then the next challenge is finding somebody who can run the company, who's going to have the respect and really become a partner with the founding scientist. It's a little bit like a marriage. It's not easy. So as well as all the kind of hard criteria, Sarah's talked about the soft aspects of mutual respect, bringing somebody in that the founder understands, yep, you know what, these guys were right. I don't have this skill set. The guy who's the CEO clearly does. So that's incredibly important an access. I think we also had to do a lot with academic institutions, but that's probably the key message, particularly from these really early stage companies: manage the relationship with the scientist who's developed this, and thinking, as well as aligning him in an economic sense, is not to be underestimated either. But I want to hand over to you, Sarah, to go through a little bit the journey of building the team.
That's a really good point. So in terms of, okay, let me just flick these up. Yeah, so I think just to kind of highlight to you guys in the audience what happened here, Adrian Hayday joined the board, so it was still hugely beneficial input to the company, but from the board rather than, as Tim described, rather than as a CEO. And then Oliver, I think he went into head cell research at the beginning, and he's still an executive with the company. Peter Goodfellow, who's our senior scientific advisor, who knew Adrian for a long time, and they first sat down to talk about this company, he chairs the board. Raj Mehta, who was with one of the founding academic institutes, he came in as the interim CEO and did a great job and set things up for Paolo Paletti to come in as the full-time CEO. Paolo, some of you may know, he headed the oncology business unit at GSK. He was also well known to us because he had been a CEO already of one of our portfolio companies. So he's like a alumnus, an Abingworth alumnus. So we had faith in him and knew that that would work well. Another one of our advisors became the interim head of immunology and helped recruit the eventual head of immunology. We helped bring in Natalie Mount because she was well known to some of us. Natalie has now gone on. Gamma Delta did a spin out, a company called Adaptate, and Natalie is now the CEO of Adaptate. So that's an example of a CSO who became the CEO. And then for Michael Kozlowski, he's the, I think, most recent hire, and a couple of years ago, and for that we worked, closely with a search firm to bring in Michael to complete the team there. So for our next example, I chose Wilson because, again, I listened to Bobby and he wanted an example of somebody who was young, who became the CEO, and again, went the distance, took the company, built the company, and took it all the way through to exit. And some of you may know Jonas and Wilson Therapeutics. Wilson were developing a decoppering treatment for Wilson disease. And, they've had this fantastic exit we'll get to now. But Jonas was young, he was smart, but he was relatively inexperienced. I think he had about 7 years experience at Janssen in sort of marketing type roles. So he wasn't a scientist. And he was able to do, what some of us may have had concerns about initially, but he was able to attract a very strong management team of people that were more experienced than he was. And they were completely respectful of him as the CEO. He commanded their respect. He did a brilliant job, but we complemented him with a very strong chair and board. So we brought in Andrew Kay, who was the former CEO of Algeta, which some of you may remember was acquired by Bayer for $2.6 billion back in 2014. And then also another one of our CEOs, Hans Schickan, another alumnus CEO who had built and sold Prosensa, Duchenne's company, to BioMarin. And they joined the boards and gave Jonas some help from the boards. He took the company public in 2016 and he sold for $855 million in 2018. So, a young guy, but did a fantastic job. So those of you out there that have ambitions, you can look to Jonas. And the final case study is IFM. Tim, do you want to just say a little bit about Gary, and we'll both pitch in here?
This guy is a force of nature, is the only way of describing Gary. So Gary was a medicinal chemist. He was a professor of chemistry at Michigan State University. So IFM, it does not stand for inflammasome or anything salubrious biologically. It stands for Italians from Michigan, because the founders all had Italian roots, as Gary did. So it's been an incredible journey. Many of you may know Gary. He's in the last 4 years has set up and transacted on 3 companies. He's generated, about $650 million in cash and about $4 billion of downstream value. So really interesting individual. As I say, an academic, incredibly strong medicinal chemistry. And we took a little bit of a punt on him. Sarah did the initial diligence and there were mixed reviews. And I think you've got to remember that many of the successful CEOs are slightly out there in some respects. People talk about obsessive compulsive disorder. It's probably one of the prerequisites for a successful CEO in biotechnology. And certainly Gary has many of those attributes. So while being an academic, he's absolutely flourished in the business environment. A very challenging individual. He's great if you're on his side. But I think somebody who has come from academia and just flourished in this environment. We're now on our 5th IFM company. He's just set up 2 other companies. I'm on the board of a company that he's just set up called Scorpion. And actually, he's progressed so well that people are simply writing this guy checks. So his latest company. There is some very interesting science, but you'll see a press release coming out. I mean, he's literally raising hundreds of millions of dollars because it's him, because he's been so successful. So this is probably an extreme characteristics, but it does tell you that good CEOs come from many different environments. And actually, it really, a lot of it is about the individual personality. Clearly, there's an intellectual level. They need to understand the industry or bits of the industry well. But he's also managed to build a very strong team and a very strong board around him. And I think that's the other trick to, good CEOs don't believe they need to solve everything, but they look to hire incredibly strong people and boards around him. And certainly Gary has that. So I don't know whether there's anything else you want to add to that, Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, I second all of that. He is really quite something, very single-minded, focused and driven. This force of nature that you alluded to. I think the only comment that might be worth making here is that I've put at the very end is that he had very hot early science. He sold it early. So if, in other company builds, he didn't need to bring on the clinical and commercial skill sets. So it may have been in other company builds that you would have to have transitioned either the CEO to bring those skill sets on, or just built around someone like Gary to ensure that you had all those skill sets. But he hasn't had to do that yet. But very, very successful, and clearly one of the examples of an academic founder who found his way into biotech in the CEO role. Okay, so that brings us to the close of our case studies, and I think we're very happy to answer questions. I think, Bobby, you're going to manage that. I saw some of them coming in as I was speaking.
I will do that. If you could do us a favor, Sarah, could you stop sharing your screen?
Yes.
That way we can maximize the viewing of us. Very good. Thanks so much. So we've had some questions. I have to say they're off topic, so I'm going to give the webinar participants here some time to generate some questions about team development in early stage biotech rather than corporate issues such as shareholdings and diligence requirements. So please consider those questions, and in the meantime, I have a few. And so basically, Sarah, Tim, I'll try and channel some of the concerns or questions we normally get at the BII from our portfolio about this whole process. One of the things we like to do is we like our companies to start thinking about finding a chair early. We have academic founders, typically postdocs, maybe some industrial experience, who are now CEO. So we try and complement by finding a chair and maybe and forming a board. These companies in therapeutics that typically hit to lead stage, do you find that to be early to start thinking about your chair? Is it possible for a company at that stage to find a good chair? And should a company at that stage start working with a board?
Well, actually, I'm interested in the point you just made. Would it be easy to find the chair at that point? I think it might be a bit tricky. I think, Tim, you should chip in here, but I think we would normally have, at the very, very early stage like that, we would often have a venture capitalist involved just to get the decision making between the CEO and the chair and the board working smoothly and quickly, and then think through at what point to bring in the chair. But Tim, what's your thought on that?
Yeah, I think, Bobby, my 2 cents are that I think a board is helpful. I keep it very small, and it's got to be operational. You can't let these early companies get sucked into bureaucratic stuff. It's got to be an operational team where you're basically helping the management to build the company out. I think the value of calling it a board rather than just some advisors is that you've probably got a better chance of hiring a slightly higher level individual, given it's a relatively early stage company. So I would do that. I wouldn't make it a huge board, and I would make it very operational, probably meeting as a small team every week or 2 at the outset of it. So I think there is merit in doing it. Chairman can be a little bit tough, I think, in terms of I'd probably build it around a 3-4 man board initially, and maybe if one of those will rise to chairman. You don't want to lock in the chairman role too early, would be my view, and it may be taken a little bit further down the road that you can then attract a higher quality chairman. What I would say is you should always remember, when you do have somebody join as a board, put a fuse on their time on the board. Tell them up front This is only going to be for a year's period. We will look to change. It may make sense for you to stick around, but there should not be assumption that people are going to necessarily change on. You will make mistakes. We all make mistakes, particularly at this early stage in terms of the individuals you want.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you so much. Great answers. And now we have questions from Tassos from IP Group. Great to hear from you, Tassos. How important is diversity in a management team?
Well, I think it's I think diversity, no matter how you define it, is really important, right? And I think I'm not quite sure how the questioner is defining it, and it could just be I think diversity of thought processes, I think cognitive diversity, I think diversity in terms of gender and ethnicity, I think all of that matters. Clearly, at the very beginning, you are going to be trying to find the very best people you can find. And if you have a process with a search consultant, you are more likely, I think, to get that diversity in. If you're just taking ideas from board members, you're going to have a smaller candidate pool. So if you go about this in the correct way and you have a broad pool of candidates, then I think it's easier to ensure that you're looking everywhere and you have diversity across the board on all those important points, because you don't want everybody thinking alike in any way, shape or form. And you want to be responsive, I think, to the benefits that we can see of diversity. So I think it is important, actually.
Very good. Thank you. I'll interject a question here. When you're looking at companies, early stage companies, and you're looking at the founder team, what are the qualities of the team that would, now we've talked about how to build it up and what you're looking for. Are there certain things that you recognize, pattern matchings, that you definitely don't want anything to do with? What are the things that pop up that would immediately make you limit your time on this company?
On the team, on the person, on the
founders, on sort of, if you're looking at a very early stage company and you're looking at the founder team, what are the behaviors or characteristics that would give you pause?
Tim, I'm thinking of the company with the big pharma, the guy with the sign in the parking lot. I think if somebody comes from a big company background, which is less likely probably in a founder, but if they come with that big company background, it can be hard for them to transition. And it's a very tricky, sometimes it's obvious, but sometimes it's quite hard to tell who's going to absolutely thrive in biotech and who isn't. And I think I alluded to that earlier. So I think people coming with a big corporate mentality, with lots of HR kind of planning manuals and signs in the parking lot about which is the CEO's car slot and things like that. I mean, I think that's one example I can think of just off the bat that we struggle with, where the biotech mentality doesn't seem to be there, and there's a question mark of whether it will ever be there.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the obvious things, you don't want people to be you don't want a team or individuals to be too narrowly focused. I think it's breadth. I think you don't want intransigence. You do actually want arrogance. You want conviction, but you do not want intransigence. And I think, the ability to listen, how they respond to questions. I think you obviously want people structured. They're making a pitch and you want them to sell their ideas, sell the vision. I think for us, we're very comfortable with technical risk. So, is this group going to come up with a breakthrough in, high throughput genomic sequencing? And we did, one of the earlier breakthrough technologies in that space. So we're very comfortable there. I think on the biology risk and kind of, conviction that the biology is always going to work out, that's for the birds. So I think those are some of the issues. I think people who are confident to build a team, and again, I think you can pick up a feeling that some people want to be autocrats, and that's not a good background. And I think to Sarah's point, these businesses, these startups are bloody hard work. You need people who are tough, resilient, but with a level of humility, because it doesn't always work out. And so I think those softer aspects, personality aspects, are actually things that we we assess and check early on as well. Of course, is the science going to change the world, and how likely are they to deliver? Background is clearly important to that. What I call reduction to practice. Do we believe that they can actually execute, and are there reasons to believe in their background that they can actually make these things happen? So I think those are some of the kind of softer things that we think about.
Very good, thank you. A question here from Raj Mehta about geographic location, and I'll add to it. So he asks, how much does location of the company impact ability to recruit a top team, and should that be a factor in choosing where to locate a company? And I'll add a corollary. In the world we're living today, where Zoom is the default, are virtual teams more doable now than they were previously?
So I've worked on multiple searches where geography has been a factor. Now, there are ways to mitigate it. And I think COVID and lockdown will help on this, right? Because sometimes the CEO does not want to be open to commuting, or there was those very little flexibility around commuting, and that's not helpful. If we've got working with a company at the moment who's had multiple attempts to find a particular C-suite hire. They have opened an office in Boston, and it's just opened up the quality and level of candidates that they can attract. So I think it actually is important, and I think that it may have helped some of the CEOs who felt that everybody had to be working in the office with them to be a little bit more flexible and creative about how to solve this problem, short of moving the company location. So I think in that sense, but I still think, I just came off a call before this one with a group that wants to hire a CFO, and they still want the CFO to be able to be sitting, post-COVID, sitting next to the CEO and sharing those strategic insights and brainstorming together. They would like that to happen in situ. Another CFO example recently in the US, where because of location, we couldn't attract the CEO, even though they had come up with an alternate location, that those CFOs wanted to be with the CEO, and the CEO was not in the alternate location. So I think it depends on which C-suite you're trying to hire for. And I think COVID has helped a little bit, but I think location will still matter. But that's just my view. Tim?
Yeah, no, great comment. I think thanks for the question, Raj. As a former alumni of Abingworth, great to have you on the call. I think the only thing I would add is that, biotech is in hubs. There are, arguably 3 main hubs. There are other hubs, and it's a pretty precarious business. So if you're a young scientist or a young entrepreneur, to go and, we had the experience in the UK where Pfizer had a huge place in Sandwich, and obviously they decided to close it down, and there was nowhere nearby for most of the employees to go. So I do think we are in a very focused industry where it's going to be hard to change that, and we probably shouldn't, to be honest with you. I think the externalities of being in environments where there's lots of other biotechs, pharma companies around, good hospitals, good universities, I think actually that's the essence of biotechnology. There are some new hubs coming up, but I think that drives many CEOs thinking in terms of where they're going to be based.
So good points, and I would add at some point, I think the BII is trying to establish, BII as a hub. So we're in that competition for recruiting talent to Copenhagen, and see if we can make that happen. But it's clearly challenging. And here's an important question from Andreas Christensen, who asks, thank you for your perspectives, and what are your recommendations on criteria for looking at executive search firms for preclinical biotech companies, and any recommendations how to structure your partnerships with them? And I would just remind you that we do have several of your colleagues in the industry from the search industry.
So don't be too rude, I think. So
yeah, well, no. I don't want you to burn any bridges without knowing it.
No, I'm not. Well, I would never mention a particular search firms, but I think I mentioned in the slides that you could take recommendations from other colleagues or other CEOs, who've had good experiences. You have to take it all with a little bit of a grain of salt, because people have very different criteria for choosing their search firms. I personally like to try and find the search firm that I think's got the best network. Other people like to get a relationship with one search firm and just keep using that same search firm. We were just talking about a CFO search for a company at the moment, and we've decided to go with the search firm that has both the life sciences expert and the CFO practice expert. So I think it very much depends on what you're looking for, but I would just seriously look at their track records and ask those track records to be within the last couple of years. Have they done have they done searches in the area that you're interested in, and can they talk fluently to you about that? Which is why we ask them sometimes to bring candidate ideas. Again, it can be anonymized. We're not trying to get free candidates. We're just trying to engage in a conversation where some of that gets teased out and you end up with a better idea of whether it's the right search firm for you. So yeah.
Any thoughts on search, retained search versus
I see. Got
pay?
it. Well, I only really use retained search. I came from that world. I think at the level of searches that we tend to get involved with at Abingworth, we're tending to get involved with the C-suite. And so at that level, you really want to tap into people who are not even looking for a job. And you want to work with a search firm that knows these individuals, has relationships with them, or knows how to get to them. And I think the retained searches do a good job there. I hope I'm not offending anyone on the call who's not a retained search firm. I think if you're hiring scientists, maybe that's very different. I just haven't been involved at that level. So I can't answer that thoughtfully. I apologize.
I think helping mapping out the spec as well, you get huge value from good retained search firms as well. Yeah.
Very good. So a question from to Embo and Zia, you might want to step in. We're going to 4 o'clock.
Yes, Bobby, we are.
All right, so we'll make this the last question. Actually, it is 4. I'm sorry, too. We won't be able to get it. I'm going to have to say thank you to Sarah and Tim for joining us on this webinar. I think this has been really informative. We've had over 100 at its max, 115 guests from all over the world here listening. So, and I think I'm pretty sure they had something of value out of this as well. Thank you so much for your participation, and thank you to the audience for the good questions. And we'll see you next time on another webinar.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.